Hello everyone. As we have seen in the previous episodes, the Spanish routinely portrayed themselves as reviving a neo-Roman empire. And in many ways, their actions match their rhetoric. Take for example, Merida, Spain. It is a city that has been continually inhabited since ancient Roman times, which is evident by the still standing ruins of Roman grandeur. The city's name derives from the time of Augustus, the Roman emperor. Initially, it was named Emerita. But the thing to note about this city is that it shares its Spanish name of Merida with another city on another continent, a Merida in Mexico. A report from 1579 explains exactly why the Spanish conquistadors chose this name. It was because they found structures, temples, and buildings every bit as equivalent, they believed, to the ruins of their own Merida. Now, it was not just the cities where they drew these comparisons. Historian and conquistador Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo made numerous comparisons between the religion of the Mexica and the religion of the ancient Greeks and Romans. In fact, the manner in which he portrays the indigenous peoples of the Americas leads one to the conclusion that the Aztecs and Inca are simply lost people, lost in the exact same manner as the pagan Romans before the time of Constantine. The Jesuit José de Acosta wrote in the 1590s when discussing idolatry, he said, quote, "Whoever looks carefully at all this will discover that the devil's method of deceiving the Indians is the same as that which he deceived the Greeks and the Romans and other ancient unbelievers, by making them believe that these noble creations, sun, moon, stars, elements, had power and authority to do their own good or evil to men." And many Spaniards compared the ancient Greco-Roman gods to those gods of the Mexican people. Oviedo compared the Aztec god of war, Huitzilopochtli, to the Roman god of war, Mars. Although he made these comparisons, Oviedo was careful to clarify things. He talked about how Satan was this timeless and universal force that had consistently led societies astray since ancient Roman times, pagan Roman times. He talked about the Mexica practice of human sacrifice as one of the products of Satan's interventions. He talked about how demons spoke to the indigenous Americans in their temples, and as a result, the Native Americans engaged in practices such as human sacrifice. But he is careful to note that this is a recurring feature in history. He noted that it was the same with the pagan Romans, that the devil interfered with them as well. And it's the same in his own contemporary society. He points to two indigenous peoples accused of witchcraft in his own lifetime to illustrate this point of continuity, the devil's continual presence in society. And just as how the Inca and Mexica civilizations were founded upon the devil's influence and upon intellectual errors, he also claimed it was the same with the Romans before they were Christianized under Constantine. In essence, Oviedo's message was the following: yeah, the Mexica people are savages, but so were our pagan Roman ancestors before they discovered Christ. It's important to understand where Oviedo was coming from. He was essentially defending the American peoples from accusations that they are not humans, that they are a bunch of savages and barbarians incapable of becoming someone like a Western European Christian. He was saying, no, they are every bit as equivalent as us Spaniards. So in many ways, Oviedo's defense of the Native Americans, their comparisons to the ancient pagan Romans, was meant to protect them from the worst abuses that the Spanish occupation was inflicting upon them. He is not against the Spanish occupation because he ultimately supports it. In order for the Mexica and other Native American peoples to be completely human, their culture needs to be fixed. And of course, it was the Spanish who would step in and fix their culture. And so ultimately, he drew an equivalency between the American hemisphere and the ancient Roman past. And part of drawing this equivalency was essentially reviving the ancient Roman ideas of imperialism. That is, we are all equal, and so therefore we should just fall into line under a single government. For the Romans, that was ancient Rome. For Oviedo, that was the Spanish Empire. In fact, the Aztecs proved that the ancient Romans were correct, that humans all over the world are indeed fundamentally the same. There is a oneness to every human being, no matter how different their cultures and no matter how different their beliefs. We all exist in a single human community. It does not matter which part of the world we inhabit at that particular time, for we are all one. The missionary Bartolomé de las Casas was another important Spanish intellectual who drew numerous equivalences between the civilization of the Mexica and the civilizations of the ancient Greeks and Romans. He even claimed that the Mexican people, quote, have surpassed the world's most prudent peoples, such as the Greeks and the Romans. Indeed, Las Casas argued that the sophistication of the Mexican civilization proved that they were every bit as rational as the ancient Greeks and Romans. That they proved the ancient Roman Cicero correct whenever Cicero claimed that in every human being resided a divine logos that enabled them to possess reason. As Las Casas phrased it, quote, all the nations of the world are men, and there is one definition of all humans, and that is that they are rational. The Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún also reinforced these ideas, saying, quote, this renowned and great city of Tula, very wealthy and with very wise and brave people, had the misfortune of Troy. The Cholulans, who are those who escaped from Tula, have had the legacy of the Romans, and like the Romans, they built their capital as their fortress. And Sahagún drew numerous parallels between the pantheons of the ancient Romans and those of the Mexican peoples. In a similar manner to the way that the Romans incorporated Greek gods into their civilization, for example, Zeus became Jupiter, Ares became Mars, Athena became Minerva. Sahagún did the exact same for the Mexica. Let's take Huitzilopochtli, for example. As we have seen, he was the Aztec patron god, their god of war. Sahagún described him as simply, quote, another Mars, god of war. And Sahagún made other comparisons. Painao was the Mexica messenger god, the god of communication, the god of envoys, a representative of Huitzilopochtli. And for these exact reasons, he was likened to Mercury, the Roman god of messages, communication, and traveling. Sahagún also compared the other Mexica god, Tezcatlipoca, as, quote, another Jupiter. This was because Tezcatlipoca was the dominant god of the Aztec pantheon. And the Aztecs routinely depicted Tezcatlipoca as a warrior with a shield, darts, and as Atlatl, a Mexica weapon. But in the Mexica pantheon, Tezcatlipoca took on many more forms. He was a sorcerer, he was a trickster, a seer, a shapeshifter. And this is why he was compared to Jupiter. Jupiter, who routinely changed into animal forms just to more women of ancient antiquity. But Sahagún also identified Tezcatlipoca with the devil, saying, quote, this wicked Tezcatlipoca we know is Lucifer, the great devil who there, in the midst of heaven, even in the beginning, began war, vice, and filth. Now this is because blackness was associated with Tezcatlipoca. In fact, some Mexica epithets refer to Tezcatlipoca as, quote, the smoking mirror, for his connection to the highly reflective stone of obsidian that was used as a mirror before the arrival of the Europeans. In fact, the Mexicans believed that Tezcatlipoca could manifest as literal darkness in the middle of the night. One of his forms was, quote, the night axe. This was a form of Tezcatlipoca which was terrifying. It was the form of a headless man with a dreadful wound on his chest that kept opening and slamming shut, each time making the exact same sound that an axe makes when slammed into a tree. And this is why some Mexica considered Tecatlipoca to be a harbinger or omen of future bad times. And also with Quetzalcoatl, who was most frequently depicted in his form as the celestial dragon. However, another form for Quetzalcoatl was that of a human priest, and therefore he was likened to another Hercules. And Sahagún found the Greco-Roman goddess of birth, Venus, in the Mexican god of Cihuacoatl. Now, Cihuacoatl had a dualistic form. The reason why Cihuacoatl was the Mexica god of her birth was because she was also a god of destruction. One of her forms was such that she was nicknamed as the Serpent Woman. She was described as a horror, as a devourer of men, and apparently brought nothing but misery and death. However, she also had an alter ego, Coatlicue. And Coatlicue was known as the fertility goddess, the goddess of birth, motherhood, and victory. And this is why Sahagún saw her as the American counterpart to Venus. Venus being the Roman god of love, beauty, desire, sex, fertility, prosperity, and sometimes also victory. And Coatlicue was apparently the virgin mother of the Aztec god of war, Huitzilopochtli. She existed to trigger wars that her son would step in and clean up. It was for these reasons that she is sometimes associated with the Mexica demons, the Chichimime. But this veneration of the other did not only go in one direction. Some indigenous peoples were extremely proud to become a part of a burgeoning, up-and-coming Spanish Empire. For example, in 1535, Charles V granted authority for the Mexican town of Tlaxcalteca to use the Habsburg coat of arms. And the use of the Habsburg coat of arms was a privilege granted to those city-states who sent numerous Indian conquistadors to help the Spanish conquistadors. Now, when Charles V granted the use of the Habsburg coat of arms, it's important to note that this was a tradition widespread and common in Europe. Many European towns in the 15th and 16th centuries had their own coat of arms for the entire city, representing the community. And you saw something similar in the Mexican societies before the arrival of the Europeans. However, with the Spanish conquest, you see these two traditions merge together. The indigenous peoples modified their ancestral emblems to reflect the incorporation of Spanish imagery. And just as how Christianity triumphed over the paganism of the Roman Empire, so too did they believe that a similar thing would happen in America, that Christianity would there also triumph over paganism. The Spanish settlers, colonists, and intellectuals were extremely aware that the Roman Empire was an empire that united a diversity of peoples under a single rule. And therefore, the Roman Empire became a model to impose this rule on other peoples. Just as how the Spanish ancestors were barbarians who were civilized by Christian Romans, so too would they do the same to the Mexican people on another continent. Talk about intergenerational trauma. The numerous priests and friars who were sent to the American hemisphere to teach Christianity to the indigenous peoples there, they were trained and educated in universities which had a curriculum which you had to read the classical works of ancient Romans in their original language of Latin. So they were highly aware of this Roman cosmopolitan heritage, which they believed they were now reviving. Exactly as the Roman Empire did centuries ago, the Spanish believed it was their turn to educate barbarians and bring them into a world community, the empire of humanity, the Spanish Empire. However, Spain did not adopt a policy of mass Romanization or Hispanification. They chose specific elites, those sons of the indigenous nobility, to receive an education. That is, they were like the ancient Romans who believed that only a few select individuals were capable of fulfilling the highest potential of their humanity. That is to say, sure, everyone's equal, but not everyone is worthy. In fact, the mixed children, half Spanish, half indigenous children of particularly well-connected or rich Spaniards, these mixed children would be sent back to European Spain to be educated. Sometimes they returned and other times they did not. For example, let's take Martín Cortés, the son of Cortés and his indigenous slave mistress. At the age of 6, he traveled with Cortés whenever he went back to Spain. He accompanied his father whenever his father visited the Habsburg court in 1529. In fact, whenever Cortés left Europe to return back to America, Martín stayed behind, and it would be 30 years later before Martín returned to America. And for the European Spanish who were born in Europe and were conquering America, they believed that they were sending their children home. That is, they considered the proper environment, the proper civilization for their children to be, not in Mexico, but in European Spain. And their experiences were all mixed. It depended on the immediate environment, the wealth and connections of their fathers. In some cases, they were discriminated against. In other cases, they were not. Though it is telling that most of them did in fact return back to America. And this testifies to the fact that in many ways, the Spanish failed to revive ancient Roman values, because when it came to ancient Roman slavery, if you were a slave in Roman times, you could potentially buy yourself out of freedom and, depending on your level of willingness to adopt Roman culture, blend into Roman society. In this regard, Spanish society was a lot more stratified and segregated. However, this was the experience of the mixed or mestizo elite. For the lower classes, the classes that belonged to poor Spaniards, they were supposed to be Romanized, Christianized, and incorporated into a global Neo-Roman empire, but not as equals. Now, this narrative of Romanization, this narrative of reviving a Roman empire, it would outlast Charles V and would continue on in his successor, Philip II. In fact, in Mexico City, Philip II put on a great festival in honor of himself. And one of his military banners was emblazoned with the Cairo, the exact same symbols that Constantine saw whenever he experienced the vision of Christ. In this way, Philip II considered himself and portrayed himself to be a neo-Constantine, reviving Constantine's glory. Philip II even adopted the addition El Grande to his name as the Great, to portray himself as every bit as equivalent as Constantine the Great and Alexander the Great. And Philip II's adoption of the Great was meant to set an example, that we Spaniards are not merely supposed to imitate the ancients, we have to outdo them. We have to go above and beyond, plus ultra. And it was because of all this classical imagery and symbolism that the Franciscan missionary Pedro de Gante called Mexico City the, quote, Rome of the New World. And all these comparisons between the Mexica people and the Romans were illustrative of the mentality of the Spanish. They were thinking and reading about Romans all the time, and as a result, they saw Romans everywhere they went. And just as how many believed that the Roman Empire lived on through Catholic Christianity, the Spanish believed that they could wield Catholic Christianity to extend Western civilization to the American hemisphere, to incorporate the indigenous Americans into a Western society, into new provinces of a neo-Roman Empire.